Namaste, Suprabhatam, and Swagatam to all our friends who are joining us this morning at the Global Festival of Yoga being organized by Indica Yoga, a platform that offers authentic, immersive, and transformative yoga experiences in the form of courses, workshops, retreats, and so on. This is the second edition of the festival, and this year we are focusing on three important themes, that is healing, well-being, and wisdom. And today we are joined by Dr. Sriram Sarvottamji. Sriramji, Swagatam.
Namaste.
Sriramji joins us from the Bay Area. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It gives me great joy and honor to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Sriramji will be speaking on a very important topic presented in the Yoga Sutra, that is Krama and Parinama. Yoga Sutra is very keen on the practice, the kind of practice that one should get involved with for to see an effective result, that is Parinama, the transformation. And there are the focus of the Yoga Sutra is also about the inner transformation. So Sri Ramji will be focusing on this aspect, the krama, the consistent small steps which leads us or which shows us the way for a big transformation that is bound to happen if we follow this path consistently. And I'll take a minute to introduce Dr. Sri Ramji. Dr. Sriram Sarvottamji holds a PhD, and on one side in science and also on the other side, he's a ERYT 500, that is experienced real yoga teacher who holds a 500-hour training program, and he has been practicing yoga since childhood and teaching for nearly 3 decades now. He was fortunate to have wonderful teachers as his masters. He studied with many renowned teachers, including Swami Bodhananda, Yogacharya Srivatsa Ramaswamy, Yogacharya Sri R. Subramaniam, Yoga Shiromani, Krishan Verma, and Sri Ravi Shankarji. Sri Ramji's prime focus to share authentic and holistic yoga practices that are rooted in classical yoga texts. He has taught over 300 workshops and retreats all over USA, led numerous mega yogathon events, and has given lectures and demonstrations at prestigious yoga conferences across the world. Sri Ramji is the co-founder and director of the Ekashri Schools of Yoga. He is also a faculty of yoga teacher training programs for several yoga institutions and studios, including Yoga Bharati, a branch of Yasvyasa Bangalore. Sri Ramji is a recipient of the Exemplary Service Award in Yoga, given by the Consulate General of India, and the Yoga Service Award given by ISKCON. Sri Ramji did his bachelor's in electrical engineering from IIT Madras, followed by PhD from Rice University in Houston, Texas. He works for the tech industry as a senior scientist in San Francisco Bay Area, California. So this is a brief introduction of Sri Ramji. Once again, I welcome you here and also thank you for joining us, Sri Ramji. Over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yavanay Chandraji. So today I'm going to present about a very fascinating topic from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. It is very dear to my heart because Patanjali, he carefully gives profound insights. He has examined the topic on inner transformation. How does transformation happen with the practice of yoga? And specifically inner transformation, the transformation of the mind. And it is very fascinating. He discusses 3 different transformations for the mind and how does it happen, the mechanisms behind it, And how can we deliberately and consciously take advantage of these teachings? How can we give a boost to our yoga sadhana, our daily practice of yoga, so that we can accelerate our inner transformation, so that we can make faster progress in the path of yoga? So allow me to begin with a short invocation on Maharishi Patanjali. Om Yogena Chittasya Padena Vacham Malam Sharirasya Cha Vaidyakena Yopakarottam Pravaram Muninam Patanjalim Pranjaliranatosmi. I offer my respects to the great sage Maharishi Patanjali, who has given the gift of yoga to transform the mind, gift of Ayurveda to heal the body, and the gift of Sanskrit grammar to heal the speech. So for these three big contributions, we are grateful to Maharishi Patanjali. So allow me to share the slides here. Okay. So the topic for today is how simple, small steps in the path of yoga lead to giant transformations, giant inner transformations. And at the heart of this presentation are these two words, krama and parinama. That's what we will examine today. And Patanjali uses these two words extensively, especially in the third chapter of the Yoga Sutras. So krama means taking small steps, step-by-step sequence of progress. And parinama refers to a big transformation, a dramatic moment where a big change takes place. Just like a single small step on the moon was a giant leap for mankind. So how small steps build into achieving a great transformation. That's what we will look at today. And I would also like to acknowledge my teachers, especially this month being the month of Guru Purnima. I'd like to acknowledge all my teachers with whom I have studied yoga. And especially this topic on Krama and Parinama, I've had the opportunity to gain insights from Yogacharya Srivats Ramaswamiji, with whom I study the Vinyasa Krama style of yoga. So when we talk about transformation, one of the metaphors that we can use for today's presentation is the same substance. We can take carbon, for example. They can present themselves in different forms. For example, the same carbon, we can see them in coal, or we can also see carbon in the form of a diamond. It's the same substance, but it can change form. And the forms can change due to some transformative processes that trigger this change, that trigger this transformation to happen. And you will notice these two forms are very different. Black coal versus a crystal clear, blemishless diamond, which reflects the light so beautifully. We can think of it as tamasoma jyotirgamaya. Tamas is darkness. From dark carbon coal, it can get transformed into transparent crystal, clear sattva, tamasoma jyotirgamaya, from darkness to light. So how does this transformation take place? So just like carbon, we can think of our mind as well as presenting itself in various forms. For example, when we feel that there is a mental fog, when the mind is clouded by confusion, or perhaps the mind is very turbulent with too many thoughts. So that is one form of the mind, that is one state of the mind. Perhaps the mind is filled with tamas, darkness. On the other hand, there are moments when we have felt very clear in the mind. As they say, the mind can be crystal clear. Perhaps crystal clear mind happens only very rarely. It's a happenstance. Perhaps it happened when we were watching a sunset or when we were deeply engrossed in music, perhaps. So, in the practice and in the art of yoga, we seek to deliberately transform the state of the mind. We would like to have a control, have a say over how the mind presents itself. Does it present itself like a dark, clouded, or filled with fog and confusion? Or would we like to have a crystal clear state of mind? So, this is the type of transformation that Patanjali talks about, how to go from a dark state of mind, a clouded mind, to a crystal clear state of mind. So, for this, Patanjali actually talks about three different transformations that are possible in the mind. Now, before we look at the three transformations that Patanjali enumerates, it is good to recall that the whole practice of yoga is for the sake of transforming the mind. Although a lot of practices in yoga are on the body, for example, asanas, and perhaps most people associate yoga with asanas, many of you know that asanas is only a very thin slice of the broad spectrum of yoga practices. Only 3 of the sutras out of 196 of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, they talk about asanas. So, whatever practice we do in yoga should serve this purpose, namely to transform the mind. So, why are we dealing with the body in the form of yoga asanas? Because in some way it is helping us to reach that state of tranquility in the mind, that state of crystal clear mind. Chitta vritti nirodha, as Patanjali defines yoga. Yoga, chitta vritti nirodha, to calm or silence the agitated states of the mind. So all our practices have this ultimate goal. Just like the different rivers of the world, they pour their water into the ocean. The final goal is the same. The goal of all our practices in yoga is the same, to transform the state of the mind. So what are the three different transformations that Patanjali lists? So here they are. The first one, which is the highest transformation that is possible to the mind, is called Nirodha Parinama. Parinama means transformation, as we saw earlier. Nirodha means to stop or to silence, to allow it to settle down. So Nirodha Parinama is the change or the transformation of the mind from a turbulent state of mind to a tranquil state of mind. From turbulence to tranquility. That is the first transformation, Nirodha Parinama, and this is the highest transformation. The second transformation is called Ekagrata Parinama. Ekagrata means one-pointed or focused mind. Many times our mind is scattered. Perhaps we are listening to something and half our mind is elsewhere, thinking about lunch perhaps. Perhaps it's happening to some of us right now. The mind is scattered and divided in different places. When the mind is shattered or scattered, we are not exactly at peace. As they say, when the mind is in pieces, there is no peace of mind. So, in order to transform this mind from a scattered, distracted mind to a state of one-pointed focus, this transformation is called Ekagrata Parinama, from a scattered mind to a one-pointed mind. And then there is a third Parinama, third transformation, which is when the mind is caught up in the ups and downs of life. Sometimes we feel elated, sometimes we feel depressed. So we are riding a huge yo-yo or a roller coaster going through the ups and downs of life. From that state, transforming the mind towards a state of samatvam or equilibrium, to an equanimous state of mind, so that whatever happens around us in our environment doesn't provoke us. We continue to remain in a state of equilibrium. So we set the tone for the state of our mind. We decide to be in a place of equilibrium, and nothing outside us can change that state. Nothing can provoke us. So this transformation from the highs and lows of life to an equanimous state of mind is called Samadhi Parinama. Three Parinamas that Patanjali is. Nirodha Parinama, from turbulence to tranquility. Ekagrata Parinama, from a scattered mind to a one-pointed focused mind. And then Samadhi Parinama, which is going through the highs and lows of life to a stable sthita prajna, samatvam, where there's an equilibrium in the state of mind. These are the three transformations that he talks about. I'm going to focus in today's talk on the first one, the Nirodha Parinama, and talk about the mechanics of how this transformation is achieved. And the same mechanisms apply for the other two transformations as well. So what is Nirodha Parinama? How does a turbulent mind, how can it be changed to a tranquil mind? So let us examine this. Now, when we look at our own mind, when we become sensitive to the thoughts that flow in our mind or the emotions that run in our mind, and if somebody says, okay, please quiet your mind, I'm sure all of us will agree that it is not a very simple task, right? Because the mind has a momentum. It has been trained. We have encouraged the mind to be turbulent. We have never taken the time to quiet the mind. We have not brought that in our practice, or it is not in our habit yet to quiet the mind in silence. Meditation perhaps is not a part of daily practice for most of the people. Whereas we have encouraged the mental chatter. So the mind is outgoing, it's extroverted, it is caught up in the events of the outside world. So the mind becomes turbulent. So, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna talks about the practice of meditation in the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, at the end of the teaching, Arjuna asks this question, oh, Krishna, you talk about all these great techniques to quiet the mind, but you know what? My mind is very turbulent. I don't think meditation is for me. He says, Chanchalam hi manah Krishna. My mind is always agitated. I don't know how I can silence the mind. It is impossible. Maybe it will work for somebody, but it is not for me, he declares. Chanchalam hi manah Krishna, pramati balavadridam. It is so unruly. Like the wind, he says. Like a hurricane. The mind is so turbulent like a hurricane. I don't see how I can quiet the mind. And then Krishna says, no. Everybody can quiet the mind. It is possible. It is possible to quiet the mind with step-by-step practice, abhyasa, and vairagya, which means not being in a hurry to reach that result. Abhyasena tu kaunteya, vairagyena cha grihyate. Through the practice and with patience, with detachment and centeredness, not craving for the result. With these two, we can quiet the mind. And we will talk about the art of yoga practice, how we can use the practice, abhyasa, in small steps, in kramas, in order to achieve that transformation a little later. So it is possible to quiet the mind. So what can we do about it? How can we start this practice so that we are able to make progress in silencing our mind? So Patanjali here gives us a great insight. He says there is a tug of war that is going on in the mind. There are two opposing samskaras. Samskaras means habits or tendencies, or the propensity of the mind to go towards one thing. So there are two conflicting samskaras. What are they? There is one samskara of the mind which is called the Nirodha samskara. Nirodha samskara means the tendency of the mind to be quiet. We all have this tendency. We all have the mind's ability to settle down. It is there, perhaps in a seed form, but it is there. This samskara or this tendency of the mind to settle down is there. The opposing tendency, Patanjali calls it the Vyutthana Samskara. Vyutthana Samskara means the propensity of the mind to be turbulent or agitated. As you see, these are opposing samskaras, opposing tendencies, just like we see in this mythology, in this legend of churning the ocean. So the Devas and the Asuras, they churn this ocean, and it's like a tug of war. And who wins this game of tug of war is very simple. It depends on which of the two samskaras or the tendencies are stronger. Is it the Nirodha Samskara that is stronger, or is it the Vyutthana Samskara that is stronger? Nominally, the Vyutthana Samskara is stronger because that is our habitual state of the mind. Unless we have practiced, we have disciplined the mind, perhaps with yoga practices, meditation, and so forth, Nirodha Samskara is perhaps a little bit weaker compared to the Vyutthana Samskara. And so we find ourselves in a place where the Vyutthana Samskara, the tendency for turbulence or agitation in the mind, is greater than the strength of tranquil Samskara or the Nirodha Samskara. So how can we change that? How can we change this? So I'm going to quote a couple of sutras from the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So the mechanism of this inner transformation, how this Nirodha Parinama is achieved, is described in this sutra. So allow me to chant this sutra. Patanjali says, Vyutthana Nirodha Samskarayor Abhibhava Pradurbhavo Nirodha Kshana Chittanvayo Nirodha Parinamaha. So the Nirodha Parinama, the transformation of the mind towards tranquility or silence, is brought about when the strength of the Nirodha Samskara, namely the strength of the silencing tendency of the mind, exceeds the strength of the turbulent tendencies of the mind. So let me go back to the previous picture here. So we have these opposing samskaras, two samskaras, one that silences the mind and one that agitates the mind. When we keep strengthening the samskara of tranquility, there comes a time when the strength of the tranquil samskara, namely the Nirodha Samskara, exceeds the strength of the Vyutthana Samskara or the agitated Samskara. When that tipping point happens, then there's a huge transformation. That is the moment of transformation. That is the moment of Nirodha Samskara. And then magic happens in the mind. The mind is now established in tranquility. Previously, the mind was established in turbulence, because whenever we examine our mind, it is so full of thoughts, and not just thoughts that are good thoughts. There is so much rampant thoughts that are useless. When our mind is caught up in the Vyutthana Samskara, there are so many useless thoughts or trivial thoughts that is going to help nobody. We are just draining our mental resources, our prana. We are draining on unnecessary thoughts. Bhagavad Gita says, these thoughts are alpa, atatvar tavad alpam cha tat tamasamudahritam. From a tamasic state of mind, these trivial thoughts, they consume all this energy. When we transform the mind from a turbulent mind to a tranquil mind, what we are doing is we are actually starting to conserve this energy. We don't deplete this energy with useless thoughts. We conserve this energy so that the same energy, the same prana, can be used for higher quality thoughts. Patanjali talks about it as Ritambhara Tatra Prajna. A mind that has settled down and is conserving its energy now has access to intuitive thoughts, to creative thoughts that can give profound insights into the truths of life. Ritambhara Tatra Prajna. So that is the use, or that is the reward of silencing the mind, so that we are able to conserve this energy, and it feels so good. Because when the mind is silent, there is a sense of peace, there's an experience of peace, and we will talk about this later in a few moments. So this is the mechanism of the inner transformation. You change the relative strengths of the two tendencies of the mind. You keep encouraging the silent tendency of the mind until the time when it is as strong or stronger than the tendency that agitates the mind. And how can we do that? How can we strengthen the silence tendency or the tranquility tendency of the mind? And the answer Patanjali gives is through krama. Krama means small steps. So in this sutra, he says, Kramanyatvam parinamanyatve hetuhu. Hetuhu means the cause of parinama. What is it that produces this parinama or this transformation is a sequence of small steps. Step by step, krama by krama. Krama means small step. So by taking small steps, we are slowly boosting the strength of the Nirodha Samskara, namely the tendency of the mind to be silent. We are encouraging that, we are strengthening the silent tendencies of the mind. And until the day when there is a shift, where there is a tipping point, and then parinama happens. In that dramatic instant of time, there is a transformation that happens in our mind. So this sutra is very powerful, very insightful, because it talks about the power of taking small steps, the value of taking small steps. In the Bhagavad Gita, we see Krishna says, Swalpamapi asya dharmasya trayate mahato bhayat. That means even a very small amount of practice, even a very small practice of yoga has great rewards. It can prevent us from great danger or great anxiety. Even little bit of practice is highly rewarding. It is very valuable. That is the promise that he gives in the Bhagavad Gita. So in order to see how powerful taking small steps are, I'm going to give a couple of analogies and some stories behind this. So a few years back in California, so there was a big drought, and so all the authorities of the state were trying to see what are the best ways to conserve water. So they did a little study. They did a little study on what is it that causes the most wastage of water. What is it that wastes water the most, so that when we know about it, we can take some measures. We can take some preventative steps so that we can start conserving the water. We don't waste the water. What they found was very interesting and very surprising. It is not the big leaks of water, or it is not that people are wasting water deliberately. It is the small water leaks, like drop by drop, that goes unnoticed. That is the largest source of wastage in water. And this is very surprising, right? Because drop by drop, one would think that not too much water is wasted. But because it is happening all the time, because it is happening 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all these little water droplets, they add up. And by the end of the week or by the end of the month, so much water has been wasted, has been drained by this accumulation of drops of water, that this was the number one, the highest source of wastage of water. And when they discovered this, they were able to take some measures. And so this was a very insightful finding. And it shows us the power of taking small steps. Even single drop of water is valuable, because when it adds up over time, it can cause a big change. So this is the power of a single drop. Now, when we talk about the tipping point, the moment of transformation, what happens is like the seesaw you see on the slide. So on the two ends of the seesaw, perhaps one is more stronger than the other. And suddenly, when we bring the tendency of the mind to settle down, to be stronger than the tendency of the mind to be agitated or to be turbulent, then the seesaw shifts. There is a tipping point, and then we go to the other side. A turbulent mind can be transformed to a tranquil mind. In fact, the science behind this tipping point has been studied recently, and this is a best-selling book. The title of the book is The Tipping Point. And in this book, the author, Malcolm Gladwell, so he became a very famous author after publishing this book. This book was published in, I think, the 1990s. And it talks about this mechanism of the tipping point in various situations and various arenas. For example, how things become viral, or how the fashion trends, they shape the world. What tipping points trigger different fashion trends or even epidemics. So there is an insightful study with a lot of mathematics behind it, and it examines this concept of the tipping point, of this parinama. And he also comes to the same conclusion that all of the tipping point, all of the transformation, the big transformation at global scale happens because of small changes, small steps that are perhaps invisible, or they go unnoticed until it makes its presence felt during the tipping point. And then suddenly there's a transformation that happens. So this is a very insightful book. And there are a few things that he mentions in this book that I thought are very well aligned with the teachings of Patanjali around the same topic of transformation. So one of the key aspects of this transformation that will be helpful in our yoga practice as well is 99 or more % of the transformation process take place even before we see the evidence of it. So let me restate that, because this is pretty insightful. 99% of the transformation process takes place before we see any evidence of it. For example, many people begin the practice of meditation thinking that, oh, I'm going to quiet the mind. After a few days, my mind will be very silent. But what they discover is, after a few days of practice, maybe after 20 days, maybe after 2 months, when they examine the mind during meditation, they discover that, oh, my mind is still turbulent. It is still filled with mental noise or chatter. There is no change that they notice. But this is where awareness of these teachings will be extraordinarily helpful, because the investment of time that we make for meditation, it is working because it is strengthening the samskara for silencing the mind. The change we will notice, the transformation we will notice, is only when the tipping point happens. Until we reach the tipping point, we may not see any evidence of the transformation, but it does not mean that our practice is not working. It is still working. And the conviction that this practice is helping me, even though I don't see any results yet, this conviction is called Shraddha. Shraddha, the faith that all these steps that I am doing will help me and transformation is taking place. So this faith or trust in that process is called Shraddha, and it is part of the practice of yoga. Patanjali says in the Yoga Sutras, Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, Samadhi, Prajna Purvaka, Itaresham. So our practice, when it is backed up by this Shraddha, trusting the process, and then Virya, which is enthusiasm in the process, Smriti, having the memory of the goal at hand, and then Samadhi, to do these practices with an equanimous state of mind. All these boost the quality of our practice. So here is an example of a transformation where we don't see the evidence of it until we reach the boiling point. So when we boil water, for example, so we start introducing heat to water, but we don't see any significant change until the temperature strikes 100 degrees C. At the boiling point is when we suddenly see the change. the water in the liquid form, suddenly it evaporates. So it changes state. So there is a transformation that happens. But every ounce of heat that we introduced to this water, even before it reached the transformation, it contributed to the final transformation, to the final parinama. So all these small steps will culminate in this transformation. So with Shraddha, with this trust in that process, when we do our yoga sadhana every day, when we do the practice of yoga every day, then for sure the big benefits of yoga, namely the transformations in the body and in the mind, it will come in due course of time. Until that time, Patanjali recommends 4 ingredients for a high quality practice. So each step, each krama, or each day of abhyasa or practice, what can we do to boost the quality of our steps towards the transformation? And that's what he gives the teaching in this sutra, which is perhaps familiar to most of you. This is a very highly quoted sutra. Satu dhirga kala nairantarya satkara asevito dridabhumihi. Satu dirgha kala nairantarya satkara sevito dridabhumihi. So he gives 4 ingredients for high quality yoga practice. The first is doing the practice for a long time. That means a long term commitment to the practice of yoga. Because we keep doing these practices, the kramas should accumulate over a long period of time before the transformation can take place, before the tipping point can take place. So the first ingredient is long time. And we will see in a moment, when we exploit or harness the power of time, we are also using the power of compounding. We will see that in a moment. We are using time to compound the benefits of yoga. The second ingredient of high quality yoga practice is nairantarya, doing the practice without a gap or without a break, without taking a holiday, doing the practice consistently every day. The third is doing the practice with enthusiasm, honor, and respect to the practice, satkara, rather than complaining about the practice or doing the practice with a sense of obligation. Oh, I promised myself I will do yoga, so I have to drag my body inside the yoga mat. Not with that attitude, but with the attitude of honoring and respecting the practice and bringing that enthusiasm, jumping into the yoga mat with a big beaming smile. We are so happy to begin the process of yoga. So with that enthusiasm, with satkara, so that is the third ingredient. And the fourth ingredient is asevitaha. That means doing the practice with a sense of service. We are serving the body and the mind, the instruments that we have been blessed with as we do the practice of yoga. When we bring in all these 4 ingredients, then Patanjali promises that the results will be firmly grounded. He says, Drida Bhumihi. The results of yoga will be firmly grounded. The opposite of that is Alabdha Bhumi, Alabdha Bhumi Katva. That means unshaky ground. In other words, the results are not yet steady. We have glimpses of silent mind, but we are not established there yet. We are teeter-tottering around the tipping point. We have not crossed the tipping point to create the transformation. That is called Alabdha Bhumi Katva. Whereas Drida Bhumi means we are firmly established, firmly grounded there. And that happens with these 4 ingredients of high quality yoga practice. So when we talk about the power of time, we saw that was the first ingredient, right? Doing the practice over a long period of time, we are also leveraging or utilizing the power of compounding. For example, in 365 days of the year, if we don't do anything to take one step forward, if we remain constant without taking any step. So you see, this is the only slide where I have introduced some equations here, I promise. So what you see here is after 365 days, we remain in the same place if we don't take any step. Whereas if we stretch 1% every day, 1% step every day, what we find is that there is an enormous change at the end of the year. All this 1% change every day during the year, they add up. In fact, they grow exponentially thanks to the power of compounding. And you see, there is a 37-fold increase in the progress in the path of yoga. This is the power of compounding. And the same thing goes when we take a step back. So when we shrink in our practice, for example, when we go back in our practice, so the transformation also happens in the other side. Perhaps a sudden illness striking the body could happen as a result of small bad habits that accumulate over a period of a long time. So here you see, when we shrink 1% every day, after 365 days, we discover we are left only with 2% of where we were originally. So this illustrates the power of compounding. The length of each step grows exponentially. And I would also like to present the same process of transformation happens in the body as well. It is applicable to the body as well. For example, in the practice of Vinyasa Krama, which is what I learned from my teacher, Srivatsa Ramaswamiji. So here is the art of sequencing a flow of asanas so that we build up krama by krama. What you see here, for example, in the first two lines of pictures, you see how we build up the sequence of Bhujangasana, the cobra posture, slowly, incrementally, until we can do some of the so-called advanced postures. Perhaps this Raja Kapot Asana. So perhaps a beginning student of yoga might find this to be, oh, I cannot do this. It is unreachable. It is not for me. But when we break down the process in krama by krama, step by step form, starting with a very simple Bhujangasana, gentle Bhujangasana, and then slowly work our way, we will find that the transformation is inevitable. It happens in due course of time. And finally, one of the points that Patanjali talks about, it's very interesting. So one of the questions that people ask when they read about the mechanics of transformation, so people have this question, oh, for so many decades, throughout my life, I have encouraged the mind to be agitated. Now, in order to strengthen my mind towards silence, do I need to invest the same amount of time? In other words, in order to undo all the Yuttana samskaras, the outgoing tendencies of the mind, will it take equally long time to silence the mind? And the answer is no. Because when we look at the two samskaras, so let me go back to this tug of war. Recall that these two samskaras, the Nirodha samskara, which is the tendency to silence the mind, and the Vyuttana samskara, which is the tendency for the mind to be agitated. It turns out that the Nirodha samskara actually resonates with the truth of who we are. In other words, our true identity, the Purusha, one of the attributes of the Purusha is that it is established in Sukham. It is established in joy. It is our natural state. And silent state is our natural state. So when we look at these two samskaras, the Nirodha samskara resonates with ourself. It agrees with ourself. It goes in the flow of ourself. Whereas the Vyuttana samskara is the opposite of ourself. It takes us to a place which is different from who we are. Patanjali talks about 4 attributes of the self, namely Nitya, Shuchi, Sukha, Atma. Nitya means it is eternal. Shuchi means it is pure, like the diamond example that we saw before. Patanjali calls it the Abhijata Syeva Mani. When the mind becomes crystal clear, it reflects the brilliance of the self. So the mind is naturally, the self is naturally pure. Shuchi, so Nitya, Shuchi, Sukha, the self abides in that place of happiness. And then Atma, the mind, or rather the self, is indivisible. So those are the four attributes of the self that Patanjali talks about, Nitya, Shuchi, Sukha, Atma. And when we look at these two samskaras, it is the Nirodha samskara that agrees or resonates with the nature of the self. So to abide in the nature of the self is an effortless task. The steps that we take towards Nirodha Samskara is effortless. We are going with the current. Whereas Vyuttana Samskara, we actually need to go upstream. We are going against the current. It is like this picture where we are moving with the flow. In the airports, we have this moving walkways. So when we are on a moving walkway and on that we take some steps towards our destination, we are actually moving faster. We are going with the flow. And when we go with the flow of the self, Patanjali beautifully describes that as Tasya Prashantavahita Samskarat. Prashantavahita, there is a flow of peace. When we take our kramas or the steps that align with the nature of the self, it becomes so effortless. It is like unmasking who we are. So when we think of a lion in sheep's clothes, when we think of a lion which is acting as a sheep, it doesn't require too much effort to go back to its nature and unleash the power from within and bring its true nature, unfold its true nature. And that is exactly what happens with Nirodha Samskara. So with Nirodha Samskara, it becomes effortless. We are going with the grain, with the flow of the self. And in order to illustrate that is this great legend of the Trivikrama, three victorious steps. So Vamana, who had such a small body, so a tiny step can be magnified with the power of the self, the power of the spirit, so that even though the physical step is small, when we bring the power of the self to it, that same krama can be magnified exponentially. Three victorious steps. So allow me to conclude by saying that the one small step that brings about this big transformation actually is built up on the foundation of thousands of previous kramas or previous steps. So when we use this deliberately, when we use this consciously, the power of the krama, then we can create huge changes in our life and we can create huge transformations globally. So thank you for your enthusiastic listening. So I welcome any comments or thoughts or any questions that you may have. Over to you, Vinay Chandraji.
Thank you, Sriramji, for this wonderful presentation highlighting the mechanics of transformation. I think it makes a lot of sense as to why the consistent efforts are required for this transformation to happen. And, and also the kind of assurance that you brought in, because many times people would be getting into practice but not being able to see the results they expect to see. They might be little frustrated with it. So but just this assurance that it will take the time, it will take some time before it manifests, but the effect is happening with the kinds of analogies that you gave. I think that's a great assurance and a message that we have received for this day. So thank you, Wonderful, for this wonderful presentation once again.
Thank you, Vinay Chandraji.
I was just referring to one of your statements here and also referring to the Yoga Sutra, the Prashanta Vahita part, where you said the Nirodha Samskaras, the propensities towards the quietening the mind, is so natural. And the Vithyana is actually like going against the flow. While it makes sense from this perspective, but going from a common man's perspective, at an experience level, it seems to be the other way around. Like getting lost with the vagaries of life seems to be the flow, and any step towards the quietening seems to be going against the flow. how do we reconcile this? How do we understand this?
Yeah, that is very interesting because when we look at an analogy, for example, so after we go about the business of the day, we come back home. So we come back to our Nirodha Samskara. We are settling down and we feel at home when we reach our residence. But suppose we are so caught up in the world that we forget how to get back home. Then perhaps that's the predicament that most of us find in. We don't know how to get back home. How do I silence the mind? So perhaps that's where we need some guidance, need a GPS perhaps, or we need some teacher who can show us the directions. So that's exactly what Patanjali assures us. So this uh, Nirodha Samskara is nothing but the directions to get back home and reside and abide in our self. And you are right, when that happens, there is Prashantavahita Samskarat, there is a very tranquil, blissful flow. And in fact, there is also a best-selling book with the same title, Flow. And it talks about, I forget the author's name, but it is also a very profoundly insightful book. It talks about the same mechanism. I was wonderstruck by how some of the same teachings that Patanjali brings in the Yoga Sutras is mentioned in the book as well. And because whenever great artists or whenever people come up with creative ideas, they go into this state called flow, a flow state, where they don't feel stagnant, but there is a blissful flow. And perhaps that is also the state that Patanjali refers to, Prashantavahita Samskarat.
In fact, as you just mentioned, when you were presenting, like I have come across this word so many times, but had never made this connection. The Prashanta Vahita, the flow, in fact, is a very important concept in positive psychology, where you get into the flow or the flourishing kind of an approach. But it's exactly in the same sense the word has been used, is something what I really could recognize now. Uh, would you like to, I mean, the words that you were referring to, or the concepts like these, would you like to just present a few, if you can recollect the important concepts that we seem to be familiar or using in the modern world, but the sources, or not just sources, but the similar ideas that can be traced back to the Yoga Sutra text? Because Yoga Sutra text is one text I feel is such an important text, should be a mandatory text for all students of psychology at least. That's what I feel whenever I read the Yoga Sutra text. So, any other concepts like this that you'd like to see that trace a connection or share some highlights of it?
It is interesting. There are so many points that we can learn and find similarities between different branches of psychology. And I'm not an expert in psychology, but I have studied whatever little I have read. I see many similarities. For example, so Patanjali talks about Pratiprasava in the second chapter, tracing back where the root cause of the problem is. So not trying to patch the problem at the surface level, at a cosmetic level, but attending to the root cause of it, tracing back the root cause, Pratiprasava, is very similar to what some of the one of the processes they employ in psychology is through regression, tracing back where or which point of time perhaps some event in the childhood that is causing this manifestation of these mental states. So like that, to trace back. So some of these similarities also I have seen. And going back to the flow state, there are many similarities that I see in other branches of science as well. To give an example, so when we talk about Prashanta Vahita, so I worked in the oil industry for about 9 years. We talk
Okay.
about how uh, we can characterize the flow of fluids. So they talk about turbulent flow and then a harmonious flow called laminar flow. So when we want to transport a fluid from one place to another, so when we open a tap, for example, when we open it very gently, we see a thin thread of water. It's not gushing, but it's a very thin thread of water. When you look at it from afar, you think it's a static, it's just like a thread. You don't see the movement, but the water is flowing. So that is a Prashanta Vahita. It's a laminar flow. Whereas when we open the tap too much, then there's a gushing flow of water. It becomes turbulent. And one of the aspects in the fluid dynamics is the least Energy to transport fluid from one place to another is through laminar flow. In other words, it conserves energy. A turbulent state of mind not only depletes energy, it also raises entropy or chaos. It leads to more wear and tear in the system. Whereas laminar flow, this Prashanta Vahita, actually uh, what they call as a reversible process, which conserves the entropy. In other words, it doesn't lead to chaos. It doesn't lead to wear and tear in the system. So we don't feel stressed out. In fact, we feel reinvigorated. We feel energized.
True, because this is the other way of classically defining dhyana. In many places in the Shastras, when the word dhyana is used, immediately an explanation follows Taila dharavat santata pravaha. Like just
Yeah,
like the oil flow, which is continuous, incessant. So that's how a dhyana should take place. So what wonderful similarities in thought. And I mean, because that's the way it is. One is the science of the external world and the other one is science of the internal world. They can't be
yes,
other way, I guess.
beautifully stated. In fact, the movement of the oil analogy that is given, I think even Vyasa gives that in his commentary on the Yoga Sutras. So we look at the definition of dhyana that Patanjali gives, tatra pratyaya ekatanata dhyanam. So the pratyaya, which is the contents of the mind, from one moment to the next, they appear identical. So when we take a snapshot of a pouring oil, when we take a picture at multiple moments in time, all those pictures will be identical.
Wonderful.
That doesn't happen with a turbulent flow. So it's fascinating how all these fit together so beautifully.
True. Thank you. I'll just move on to the questions and the comments that we are receiving. There's a long list of wonderful acknowledgements of what you have provided today, what you have shared. So people are extremely grateful for what they have received. So thank you very much on all their behalf. Uh, I'm going to Sri Dhar Ravalji, who says, so good to see you after so many years, Sri Ramji, who is joining from Houston. He says, oh, what a wonderful exposition. Is it possible to regress after the tipping point? If not, how do you know tipping point has been reached?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, in one of the sutras, Patanjali describes this. It can reverse itself. In other words, after we uh, create the transformation, once we go over the tipping point, coming back is also possible. Sometimes when we are at the boundary of the tipping point, when we have glimpses of a very peaceful state, we may start becoming complacent. In other words, we have not strengthened the silent, the settling down of the samskara, but we get complacent thinking that, oh, I've reached, I've had glimpses of inner peace. And if we discontinue the practice, or if we are not as committed to the practice as before, perhaps we will be on that boundary. We might teeter totter from one side to the other. So it is possible to come back, to regress back in the uh, reverse tipping point, if I could say that.
Connected with the same progression in sadhana, I have a question from Dr. Jay Gupta ji, who is asking, why is that when we are progressing in quietening the mind, there is abrupt explosions of strong emotions? This it does that mean the progress is abrupt or non-systematic, or is it part of the healings of various raw emotions that might have been there earlier? How do we understand this?
That's exactly correct. So the way my teacher used to explain this is, so there are seeds of disharmony. So these are the what are called the klesha mulas and the karmashayas, that Patanjali uses these terms in the second chapter. So the seeds of disharmony that are residing, that go unnoticed, because our mind is constantly extroverted. We are not as sensitive to the state of our mind or our body. So we don't catch all these subtle seeds of disharmony. Perhaps they are buried under the carpet, to use a metaphor. So when we practice meditation, so all these seeds of disharmony, they surface up, and perhaps it's a little bit of a discomfort. It's not a very pleasant experience, but then when we scrub it out, when we clean it out, it takes us to a deeper level of tranquility. So, to use a technical metaphor, it is like going from a local minima to a global minima. So, perhaps we are stuck in a place where we think we are comfortable, but beyond our comfort zone is a deeper place of bliss, a deeper place of comfort. So, we have to go over, we have to, uh, that's where tapas comes in, the willingness to expand our comfort zone, to go outside of our comfort zone, to seek a higher comfort or a deeper state of happiness. And so, in that process, all these seeds that are residing in our perhaps subconscious mind, they surface up and we clean it up with the light of awareness. So, in the words of my teacher, he used to say, burn the seeds of disharmony even before they sprout.
Hmm.
So, rather than waiting for it to manifest in a bigger, more profound way, so when they surface up, we simply clean it up.
True. And in fact, this aligns so well with the kleshas and the four modes of operation of the kleshas. So you have the Vyuthana, you have the Tanu state. So there are various states, and of all the four states, the way you need to deal with the kleshas is through the Tanu Karana. That means you have to bring it to a conscious level. So all these raw or disharmonies, they come to a conscious level, and only then you will be able to deal with it. Just by keeping it below the mat will not be helpful. I think meditation is also that process where you actually start consciously cleaning various layers, and we just don't know what are all hidden in those layers.
Very beautifully stated. Yes, you are right. Patanjali talks about the practices that we do with action, with Kriya Yoga. He says, Samadhi Bhavanartha Klesha Tanu Aranartha. So the kleshas, they become very small and subtle, but our actions, what we do with our, with in Kriya Yoga, with actions, can only reduce them. They can make it Tanu, but they cannot eradicate or deplete them. For that, actions cannot help, meditation helps. So in the same segment, Patanjali says, Dhyana heyas tadvrittayaha. So dhyana, meditation, it uproots the kleshas. Not only does it make it small, so we make it small with action, and then we uproot it using meditation. So that is the teaching, that's the insight he provides. So we need both action as well as silencing the mind.
So thank you very much. So I want to next question from Manoj Soniji, who's asking, what is your perspective on not sustaining the initiative which is required to achieve the ultimate while we plan to transform, and what are the techniques to steady your mind? Maybe there are two parts in this question. The first part is a more universal uh, quest that people would have. Because when we start something, there is a greater initiative, there is greater enthusiasm, there is motivation. But gradually, as we go, while on one side we are convinced about the benefits of all these practices, yet the motivation seems to go down for whatever reason. Or one, as you were saying, one needs to drag oneself to get into the practice. So, how do we overcome this inertia?
Yeah, my teacher used to give examples of how we can trick the mind so that we remain committed to the practice. For example, to start the practice not just by oneself, but form a little group where each of us in the group can motivate each other so that when someone's enthusiasm is sagging, then the others in the group can build up that enthusiasm. And of course, one of the great ways is to be around people who already have this practice well established, who are very dedicated, who are very enthusiastic about the practice. In fact, I'm reminded of one of the sutras of in the first chapter of Patanjali. He says, "Vitaraga vishayam va chittam." In other words, when we direct our mind towards people who already have that value that you wish to cultivate. For example, I would like to cultivate the habit of doing yoga practice every day. Then think of somebody who already has that well established. Think of someone who has already nailed it. They're
Hmm.
doing practice every day with enthusiasm. Be friends with them, and it becomes contagious in a good way because we'll also get inspired by them. And one of my teachers, Sri Sri Ravishankarji, he gives this example of when you pour water in a container, it takes the shape of the container. So when we pour our awareness to somebody who has this value already, then our mind will take the same form. We also become enthusiastic about the practice. So these are some of the ways in which we can reinvigorate our commitment to the practice.
Hmm. I think that's a very useful practical tip to form a community or a small group or to have that peer connection and support network. And I also see it emerging in many ways during these the times when we are technologically enabled. For example, the challenges, various challenges people throw up, like 1 month of Hanumanasana, 1 month of backbending. I mean, these are various ways in which these ideas of building a support network is forming using these various apps and digital platforms. In fact, I'd like to just share, we had ran a program called Suryathon, that is Surya Namaskar Marathon, as a running up to the Global Festival of Yoga. And when we started it, we were not sure what kind of response we will get. That was a we had used a app. We had tied up with a digital service provider where we had an app where you had the instructions for Surya Namaskar along with the mantras, and people where they can use it and do the Surya Namaskar. So as though a teacher is guiding them. So this we were not sure how the kind what is the response, but later over the period of 20-25 days we saw it picking up like anything. And there was also one more thing that we had added, another dimension as a motivating factor. For every Surya Namaskar that one does, rupees 10 will be raised for COVID relief. So, and with this, we were able to generate about 1.6 crores and about 27 lakh Surya Namaskars cumulatively, with about 22,000 people joining in from across the world. So it had happened using this platform. So this is just to add to your point, like if today we need to form a community or something, and there are various ways. Technology has enabled us like never before to form it. If we are not, if physically it's not possible, at least there are digital platforms, there are various other possibilities to form this. But forming a support network, I think, is extremely helpful, and we need to realize and harness the kind of motivation that one gets out of it. So thank you,
Thank
Shri.
you so much for sharing on that, how this initiative has helped the whole global community. And I'm reminded of the Asevita that Patanjali says, doing the practice as a way to serve. So, not just serve our own body and mind, but serve the planet through this practice. And that's exactly what you did. That's an amazing initiative.
In fact,
Also, let me um, share a small story around this, my own personal experience of how I was able to establish my personal practice every day. So I started learning yoga when I was 11 years old, and my first teacher, with whom I studied for 14 years, his name is Yogacharya R. Subramanian. And my first 2 or 3 years, my commitment to the practice of yoga uh, was not that intense. I joined the yoga class. I was 11 years old, so I was not really seeing the value of yoga yet. So what I thought was, okay, now I'm able to touch my toes, so I don't need to practice every day. That was the attitude that I had. So I have achieved this asana, so why should I practice every day? So, and my teacher knew this. He knew that I don't practice every day. But as all great teachers, he used to take very good advantage of what is called teaching moments. He used to look out for moments where a profound teaching he will unleash to his students. And one such thing happened to me that really transformed my perspective on daily practice of yoga. So one day, so he used to take his students to lecture demonstrations. When he gives lectures on yoga, few of us will be demonstrating on the yoga mat on stage. So in one such event, so we had a huge event in the Madras University, and we had about 500 people in the audience. And I was one of the two models demonstrating Surya Namaskar. And he was giving instructions. So we were demoing the Surya Namaskar with lots of variations, and the audience was impressed. And at the end of the practice, my teacher, he said to the audience, so in order to achieve this level of excellence in asanas, it can only happen with daily practice of yoga. And then he turned to me and said, you practice yoga every day, right? On stage in front of 500 people.
Oh,
And at that time, I simply nodded my head, yes. And I felt very guilty about it because that was not true. It was not a true statement. So I decided in that moment that I will practice yoga every day. I'm not going to miss my practice ever. And till now, I have not missed a single day of practice. So that was a very powerful teaching moment. It was a tipping point for me. And so great teachers like him, he uses these teaching moments to create such a big impact on students. And I'm very grateful for that.
true. I completely agree with it. These teachers have their own methods, and which one cannot even realize what they have in mind or why they are doing it. There is even a possibility of being offended at that moment, but yet they know how to bring about that impact or that parinama. So thank you very much, Sri Ramji, for this wonderful sharing. I mean, even sharing of this incident. And yeah, we are so grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think the questions are growing, but maybe I think I'll hold on this point. But there are also a lot of compliments coming your way. It says, uh, Raghavanji says, very well explained. One needs endurance and patience. Will you suggest a methodology to follow? Again, I think you shared some tips there. And then Dr. Jai Gupta ji is reminding about the book Flow. This is by Mihilai, who is a well-known author in the field of positive psychology. So Shobhana ji says, very inspiring talk. I'm sure, I think this presentation has reminded everyone to gather themselves and get on to mat, whichever mat, whether it's the asana mat or the meditation mat, but get into a daily practice and the importance of consistently building it and compounding it. I think the mechanics were also extremely convincing one as to why one needs to continue on this path. So thank you very much, Sri Ramji, and we look forward to being in touch with you for various offerings here. So once again, I'm grateful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Namaste.
Uh, I'll get back to you with two things. How can people connect with you? And also a message that you would like to leave our participants with for the day. Before that, I'd like to make the announcement of evening's event. And also, since we were discussing about Suryathon, we have a 1 minute video showing about the highlights of the Suryathon. Maybe I would be happy to show that to all our participants now. Yeah, I'll make the announcement and come back. So this evening, we have a session with Dr. Lamport, who will be speaking on the spine in pranayama and meditation. We have discussed about the importance of meditation now. We need to understand the transformation that happens even at the physiological level and the kind of work that takes place when we are doing pranayama and meditation. So both these sessions complement each other and definitely give us a greater motivation to continue with our practices. So do join us for this journey for the Global Festival of Yoga, which continues up to next Sunday, that is 18th July 2021. And before I get to Sri Ramji, I'll quickly share this video.
सङ्गच्छध्वं संवदध्वं सम्भो मनांसि देवाभागं यथा पूर्वे सञ्जानान उपासते समानो मन्त्रः समिते समानि समानं मनः सह चित्तमेषा समानं मन्त्रमभिमन्त्रयेव समानेन वो हविषा जुहोमि समानेवाकूतिः समाना हृदयानिव समानमस्तु वो मनो यथा वः सुसहासति समानमस्तु वो मनो यथा वः सुसहासति.
So this was a summary video of all that transpired in that 1 month program. And on the Suryathon Validatory Day, we had Venkatesh Murthy ji who had joined us and who made a very... I think there is some lag happening. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Venkatesh Murthy ji made a very valid remark. He said, the ends of yoga should be twofold. One is sadhana. All of us are familiar with it, but also the seva aspect. Sadhana and seva should tag along. And that's exactly what Sri Ramji, you were also mentioning, the asevita part. I think that makes a lot of sense. And thank you again for bringing us this kind of motivation in continuing with the kind of work that we need to do for both inner transformation and also the outer one. So how do people follow your work, know the courses that you're offering, or is there any way that they can connect with you?
Yes, so you can easily look us up on our yoga school. You can Google Eka Shri Schools of Yoga, EKASHRI, Eka Shri. That's the name of the yoga school. And we currently have weekly yoga classes. We also conduct teacher training programs, which are Yoga Alliance certified, both 200 hours as well as 300-hour certification programs. And coming up, in fact, starting next week, I'll be teaching a 11-week-long Patanjali Yoga Sutra workshop. So one session per week. It is offered through the Hindu University of America, HUA.edu. And I'll be teaching this course called Yoga of the Yoga Sutras. And here we will be exploring systematically the teachings of Maharishi Patanjali, and we will cover the main tenets of yoga philosophy based on that text. And so that's what we'll be exploring for 11 weeks. And if this interests you, then please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And yeah.
And how can people reach out to you? They can find the contact details and the Eka Shri school website.
At the website, yes.
Yeah, wonderful. And one last thing, what's a message? In fact, you have given a very straightforward message and it's very clear. Practice. But something else that you'd like to add at this moment, whatever you're inspired.
One more time practice. So the key, I guess, is that it is not that we need to do the practice with a lot of effort, because most of the time people have this idea that practice means it's a lot of exertion. As I said, like drag the body in the yoga mat, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's not like that at all. The uh, teachings of Maharishi Patanjali around transformation, we saw that even a tiny bit of practice, even if we have 5 minutes, my teacher used to say this, even if we have 5 minutes to practice yoga every day, that is extraordinarily beneficial. In those 5 minutes, we can do incredible things. We can do 8 rounds of Surya Namaskar and we can meditate. Of course, it doesn't mean limit your time to 5 minutes a day of practice, but whatever little time we have, we can invest some yoga sadhana there, and even a little bit of practice. Swalpamapyasya dharmasya trayate mahato bhayat. Even a little bit of practice, as Bhagavad Gita says, can lead to extraordinary benefits.
So thank you very much, Sri Ramji, for this message, and more than the message, the kind of convincing manner, both in terms of the presentation, in the analogies, in the scientific explanation of it, how in a very comprehensive manner you have made us to understand the importance of this, and I think all our friends are motivated, and they will take this message very seriously. So thank you very much for being with us and for sharing with us this morning. And I also thank all our participants for joining in such a lively manner, interacting. The comments, the questions are also still growing in the list, and many of them are very keen to connect with you as well. So, yeah, I thank all of them and thank everyone. Namaste. Shubha Dinam.
Thank you. Namaste.